Welcome to this week's episode of the Jewish Diaspora Report. On this week's episode, we talk about anti-Zionism, Islamophobia, and shutting down the discourse. Let's get started. The word Zionism today seems to have many meanings to different people. The word Islamophobia is thrown around. And honestly, in order to better understand the situation that's going on today, currently in the diaspora, we definitely need to understand these terms and understand what they were invented for, how they're being used today, and even how things are changing. There's no surprise to anybody who's been listening to this podcast or frankly has had their eyes open in the Western world to know that the anti-Semitism, the hatred of the Jewish people, has been on the rise for months now at an exponential rate. The numbers that we are seeing across the world of hate crimes and attacks on Jews and fire bombings of synagogues and shootings at schools, it's unbelievable. What at one point at the beginning, since October 7th and 8th, when the first protests came out, if you remember, they always started with this whole idea of being anti-Israel protests. And no, we're anti-Zionists. We're not anti-Jews. Stop calling us anti-Semitic. Being anti-Zionism is not anti-Semitism, which we've on this podcast talked endlessly about the fact that there are some connections between the two people, the anti-Semites and the anti-Zionists. It seems like there's a lot of overlap there. But if you want to hear that episode, go back and you can hear what I've said on that topic. But what is very clear here is the fact that the cover of "We Are Just Anti-Zionist" has really worn off over the last number of months. Maybe they're getting tired, they're getting lazy, maybe the truth is just coming out as the war continues, that this is just blatant anti-Semitism. They don't even really speak about Zionism anymore. Now they are carrying Hezbollah flags and Hamas flags and essentially saying that we are going to rape and murder your people and go back to Europe and go to the ovens and Hitler was right. Not exactly sure how any of that has anything to do with Israel, just the Jews. And as I mentioned before, the fire bombings of synagogues, the protests outside synagogues, the shootings at Jewish schools, the threatening of Jewish people on the street, has nothing to do with Zionism, has nothing to do with the state of Israel. So we've all kind of seen the shift where they've given up this whole Zionist idea, despite the fact that they still claim not to be anti-Semitic. As a side note, in an interesting post by Shai Davidai, one of the Columbia professors who's been very outspoken against the issues he's been facing on campus recently, he said very interestingly, the fact that if you notice, after every protest outside a synagogue or any kind of attacks on Jewish people, they always seem to follow it pretty quickly with an explanation as to why they did it, to justify their actions. We don't really care why you're attacking Jews or how you choose to justify attacking a synagogue. The reality is that it's wrong and anti-Semitic. I don't care if it's because you think some real estate deal is going on inside Israel and they're selling land, which is complete lies. You are still being anti-Semitic by the actions you're taking, by choosing to go to a synagogue and protest or physically assault Jewish people at a synagogue. In order to better understand this, I kind of wanted to go back to an old podcast we had where we discussed the issue of Zionism. For some of my new listeners, you might not have heard this, so just really quickly, the official definition of Zionism by any Jew, by the way, 95+% of Jews are Zionists. So if you say you hate Zionists, you essentially are saying we hate most Jews, but we'll get back to that in a second. The definition of Zionism is simply that the Jews have a right to a safe homeland of their own in their ancestral homeland. That's it. There's no mention of Palestinians. There's no mention of kicking people out, exterminating, genociding, anything like that. The Palestinian Arabs of today, and even the Palestinian Arabs of 1948, literally do not show up in the definition of Zionism. Zionism doesn't talk about kicking out other people, taking over the land illegally or legally or by force or by peace. It is simply the idea that most people believe in, that the Jewish people have a right to safety and self-governance in their ancestral homeland. And yet, today, that's apparently a problem. If we were to believe the supposed anti-Zionists, Why is it that they have a problem with Zionism as we've just defined it? As, let's be honest, the Jews get to define what Zionism is. Why is it that anyone else gets to tell the Jews what Zionism means? We're the ones who invented it. But when it comes to Jews, everyone else gets to decide and define what anti-Zionism is and whether or not that is directed at Jews or not. By the way, just as a little side note, you'll notice that whenever they talk about anti-Zionism, it's always pointed at the Jews. Never do you see them protesting or firebombing evangelical Christian churches, because evangelical Christians are extraordinary Zionists. But I have not heard one shooting at a Christian evangelical church, a firebombing of a church, nothing like that. Why is it just coincidentally that all the anti-Zionism actions happen in Jewish areas, in Jewish schools and synagogues? Must be just a heck of a coincidence. Or maybe it's just anti-Semitism. And funny enough, it just seems very crazy to think about, but maybe there's a little tip here on the whole anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism thing. Why is Israel the only country that is up for debate on whether it should or shouldn't exist anymore? It's pretty crazy to think about. The same time Israel was reestablished, because it's thousands and thousands of years old, countries like Iraq, Syria, Jordan, all these other countries, Pakistan, India, they were all created. Nobody today sits here and says, well, do I debate on whether or not India deserves to be a country? Do they have a right to exist? Nobody thinks that. Nobody asks why the Arab states have a right to exist, even though they were created at the same time by the same people. So the idea of Zionism today may actually be somewhat useless, or at least it's just a weapon that's being used against the Jewish people. And maybe if you look deep down, since people only have an issue with the state of Israel and its existence, is maybe why they have an issue with that. Why not other states, as I said? Maybe the issue isn't we don't believe you deserve a state, but more so we don't believe Jews have a right to either A, exist, or at least exist in safety. We believe you guys should be set to the fringe of society and be harmed and killed and exiled and expelled like the historical Jews of many, many years ago. You don't deserve safety, is what being anti-Zionism essentially means, which apparently is totally normal for people to do these days. And it seems like their actions definitely line up with the idea that Jews don't deserve to be safe anywhere in the world. It's really absolutely crazy to see people speak out against quote-unquote Zionism. I'm anti-Zionist or whatever. But the funniest thing, and most tragic thing, is how many people who are Jewish will be, quote, anti-Zionists. We've talked about this in the past on many podcasts, how ironic it is, self-hating Jews, wanting to fit in with their popular lefty culture, very much lack of education and lack of history knowledge, causing them to essentially give up on their own people and their own safety and their own homeland. This past week, I had a great conversation with one of our biggest followers. I love having conversations with her about different things. This woman is a huge Zionist, if we want to use that term still, not Jewish. But the amazing thing was she brought up to me that she recently had a conversation with someone who is Jewish, and she felt really uncomfortable calling this person out about the falsehoods that this listener of our podcast knows are blatantly false statements. So a Jewish person, essentially, is telling her all of these facts that she knows are wrong, but she didn't have the confidence as a non-Jew to tell a Jewish person that they're wrong on some of these facts and these histories and these realities in Israel. And it got both of us thinking. The statement, quote, as a Jew, which we hear all the time. When I say, as a Jew, I believe X. And somehow that is designed to essentially tell anybody who's not Jewish to shut up. You don't get to talk. I'm a Jew. And so therefore, whatever I say goes, despite the fact that there are a slim minority of Jews who are completely dumb on the whole topic. And my listeners, including you, know way more than some of the Jewish people who are on the streets peddling some lies and Hamas propaganda. And the amazing thing is that these tokenized, whatever you want to call them, pick-me Jews are out there saying, quote, as a Jew, pretending like that is the end of a conversation. You are not allowed to speak because I know more than you just by being a Jew, which is completely bullshit, if I may say. Just because someone is a Jew doesn't mean that they have a clue what they are talking about. And hopefully, like my listener, you will have the confidence to stand up and share facts that you know are true, despite this person being a Jew. They don't necessarily know more than you. And if you know the fact, you call them out, despite the fact that they say, quote, as a Jew. We don't care if you're Jewish, if you're spreading lies and being, quote unquote, anti-Zionist, because you don't even understand what Zionism means. How are you having a conversation if you don't even know the definition of Zionism? Because if you did know the definition of Zionism, you sure as hell would be with the rest of us 95+% of Jews who support Jews having the freedom and safety of their homeland. Because you'll be first on the block when they come and kill you in the next Holocaust. Being an anti-Zionist sure as hell ain't gonna help you. And now this gets us to the next topic, when we talk about shutting down discourse and saying, quote, as a Jew, meaning shut up, you don't get to talk, I'm Jewish, I can say whatever I want, and you need to listen. Some would suggest that this is the exact same thing that was invented when they came up with the term Islamophobia. For us, people who may be a little more naive, we might think that Islamophobia was intended simply to point out people who hate Muslims or have a fear of Muslims, which is the official definition. I am absolutely positive that there are people out there who dislike Muslims for an irrational reason. They may have never met a Muslim, they may have only seen stuff on social media, and have no reason to hate Muslims other than Islamophobia. But what we are seeing now is the tool that is being used by people to shut down discourse, just like the as a Jew statement. When someone says something negative about Islam or about people who follow Islam, immediately people will say Islamophobia and try and call you out and say, I'm sorry, you are not allowed to say that because speaking out against my religion is not allowed. That is racism against my people. But the point of Islamophobia may be to shut down conversations about actual issues we are seeing in the world today. I find it very hard to imagine the idea of an irrational fear. Again, Islamophobia suggests irrational fear. What we're seeing today on the streets, which by the way isn't just Muslims, there are many unfortunate white American Western people who have no connection to Islam whatsoever, but Islam, and radical Islam especially, is very much involved in what we are seeing on the streets today. The fire bombings, the shootings, the beating up of Jews on the street, the calls for intifada, the calls for jihad. These are Islamic ideas. So the idea of calling it Islamophobic, meaning an irrational fear, is kind of silly. Because I think Jews might have an actual rational belief that they might be harmed by people who support radical Islam. When you see people walking the streets with Houthi flags and Hezbollah flags and Hamas flags that literally represent death to Jews, saying that they want to repeat the Intifada, is it irrational to be afraid? I don't think so. And just for the record here, I'm not suggesting that every person who practices Islam is involved in this issue or wants to see the death of Jews. But what I am saying is that the extremist Islamic ideology that is fueling all of what's going on today is within Islam. As some others have said, it seems pretty rational to be afraid about things we are literally seeing in our own streets and across the world. And yet, for some reason, we are using the term Islamophobia to simply stop any criticism of legitimate fears that are happening in the streets of North America. And the funny thing is, maybe Islamophobia doesn't really work anymore, because Islamophobia, there is kind of a real rational reason for Jewish people especially to be afraid of radical Islam. You know, we see ISIS, we see Hezbollah, we see all these people who are actively calling for the death of Jews. That's pretty rational. I can't think of any other word other than rational, to be afraid of people calling to kill you and seeing people in the streets trying their best to actually do it. Funny enough, maybe we have seen a little bit of an acceptance of the fact that maybe Islamophobia isn't so irrational anymore, and that we can't use it as the shut down all conversation situation. Because you can't call someone who is a pro-Israel Zionist, not wanting Jews to be killed, an Islamophobic person, because that has nothing to do with Islam. Or on that same note, you can't call someone Islamophobic who fears the people who are literally in keffiyehs out in front of their door with firebombs and guns and knives trying to attack you. It's not really irrational. So we have to see a little bit of a shift now in order to shut down the discourse. Very recently, in the Toronto District School Board within Canada, we had a very interesting situation happen. We had a group of trustees, so these are people who set the policies for the entire school board, making sure that there's no issues within schools. It's kind of like the community's voice within the school board to make sure that parents and students are heard. And what is most disheartening is the fact that there were many Jewish students who came forward, and parents, saying how terrible the schools are in the Toronto District School Board for anti-Semitism. We had students from all different grades talking about how bad things have gotten. They've been called dirty Jew, literal bullying, and to the point where parents are literally pulling their students out of school because it is no longer safe for them. And the school board essentially kind of goes, look, I don't know what to do here. But what's most insane is that at the end of this meeting, not only did they not deal with the issue of anti-Semitism in their school, they kind of ignored that for the most part. They added, believe this or not, anti-Palestinian racism. This is in addition to the Islamophobia that's already on the books. They added specifically anti-Palestinian racism. Now, I don't exactly understand what anti-Palestinian racism is, to be honest with you. I don't know of any Palestinian mosques that are around. I mean, I'm sure there might be Palestinian areas of Toronto. I don't think so. I'm pretty sure there are Muslim areas of Toronto filled with Muslims from all over the Middle East. I have not seen one Jewish protest threatening a Palestinian business or a Palestinian mosque. There's racism against Arabs and Muslims for sure, but specifically Palestinians, I don't even know how that would work. But then the more I really thought about it, the more I realized what they were trying to do. The old-fashioned version of calling everyone Islamophobic if you dare speak out against actual issues within Islam or Islamic communities, that's not working anymore. So what they're trying to do essentially now is make an anti-Palestinian racism, which essentially means anybody who is a Zionist, anyone who believes in Jewish freedom, Jewish safety, Jews having equal rights, or are essentially against anti-Semitism, will and can be deemed anti-Palestinian. Because if you believe you have a right to exist in your homeland, that obviously means that you don't believe in Palestinian rights to exist or have a state. And therefore you are anti-Palestinian by being pro-Jewish. Do you personally find it offensive when someone wears a keffiyeh to work or school? Because that would make you anti-Palestinian. Do you not like when someone says from the river to the sea while screaming Intifada revolution? Because that would also be anti-Palestinian. It's unbelievable the thought process they put in here to stop these parents who had come to this meeting in order to express their concerns over anti-Semitism and the way that Jews are treated in schools and having to pull their students out of schools due to the anti-Semitism. And instead of taking that seriously, they decided to add a new way to stop parents from complaining and students from complaining, and a way to punish those students if they dare stand up for themselves as proud Zionists. Under threat of being labeled an anti-Palestinian racist, it's honestly just a next level of anti-Semitism that we're seeing in North America. And the way that this takeover of the system itself is creating and allowing people to further the anti-Semitism and ensure that Jew hate only is allowed and nothing else is allowed, and Jews should just fend for themselves or frankly just leave school altogether. In the end, the idea of anti-Zionism as a thing is actually pretty ridiculous. Anybody who claims to be anti-Zionist clearly does not know what the word Zionism means. And if they do know what the word Zionism means and you don't support that, then I'm really sorry for you. You are beyond anti-Semitic. And the way that Islamophobia and now anti-Palestinian racism has become a weapon and a tool to shut down any legitimate fears and criticisms that Jews have to protect themselves and to try and beg for the country and the world to see their problems, I fear whatever is coming next. Because I hope I'm not seen as an alarmist here, but we've seen this before. We've already seen the universities now becoming completely unsafe for Jews. We saw that also in World War II, where Jews were forbidden from going to universities. We are now slowly finding the anti-Israel bias and the anti-Semitic hate within elementary and high schools being very much on display within at least the Toronto District School Board, but many others. I really fear what the next step is here. We are seeing slowly as Jewish synagogues and businesses and schools and everything else are being attacked. We see open hatred towards Jews in the streets under the guise of we're not being anti-Semitic, which is completely bullshit. And we're seeing a system that is rewarding those who are doing the anti-Semitic acts. They are not only not standing up for the Jews, they are apparently entrenching laws that forbid Jews from speaking out in favor of their own best interests. They are trying to shut down the Jewish people from speaking for themselves and advocating for themselves in order to leave them even more helpless within this system that is being set up against them. I'll be honest, I'm really losing hope in the American and Canadian systems. The whole West is allowing people to take over what used to be equality and rights for everybody and make it essentially rights for anybody we agree with and no rights for those who we dislike based on completely arbitrary ideas. We, Jews and non-Jews alike, need to stand up and put an end to this BS that's going on within the system. We need to put an end to the ideology that allows people to stop conversations with the mere mention of I'm a Jew or I'm a Muslim or Islamophobia, because as long as we can't talk about what's going on the streets and in schools all over Canada and North America, nothing is going to change, and the Jews will continue to be threatened and anti-Semitism will continue to rise unchecked. This has been another episode of the Jewish Diaspora Report. Don't forget to check us out on social media at jdr.podcast and check out some of our other episodes on your favorite podcast source. We'll see you next time.